The laugh came first, before any words did, and it carried across the marble lobby the way a dropped glass carries, sharp and bright and impossible to take back. It was a Friday evening in late October, and the grand opening of Vosburn Tower was at its loud and shining peak. 41 floors of new glass stood lit against the river, and the lobby at its base had been turned into a room meant to take your breath. White orchids in tall vases, a string quartet near the elevators, waiters threading between investors and city officials with trays of champagne that caught the light from a chandelier the size of a small car. Everyone in that room had been told, in one way or another, that they were standing inside the future. And, in the center of all of it, near the foot of the great floating staircase that curved up from the lobby, like a ribbon of pale stone, a man in a charcoal suit looked at a woman in a worn brown coat and laughed in her face. His name was Del Pruitt, and he was the director of sales for the whole development. He had a lanyard credential tucked into his breast pocket, a watch that he turned toward the light when he wanted you to see it, and the easy confidence of a man who had spent the evening being told he was important. He had been watching the door. It was his job to watch the door. And when he saw the woman come in off the wet street in a coat the color of an old penny, with the collar darkened by rain and one button replaced by a slightly wrong shade of brown thread, he decided what she was before she had taken 3 steps. The woman did not laugh back. She did not flinch. She stood with her hands at her sides and let his laugh finish, the way you let a kettle finish its noise, and when it was done she simply waited, as if the laugh had been a small weather event and not an insult. Here is what you need to understand about that moment before we go any further. The most important person in that lobby, the one person whose name would matter more than anyone else's by the end of the night, was the woman in the worn coat. And not a single soul in that bright and humming room knew it yet. Least of all, the man laughing at her. Her name was Imani Sablon. She was 47 years old, and she had come to Vosburn Tower that night because she could not sleep until she had stood inside it and seen for herself what she already suspected was wrong. Let me take you back, because none of this makes sense without that coat, and the coat does not make sense without her father. Imani grew up in a 3rd-floor walk-up on the east side of a river town that does not need a name, the kind of place where the buildings were old and honest and held up by the labor of men nobody photographed. Her father was one of those men. Cassius Sablon was a structural welder and a steam fitter, a man with forearms like braided rope and a quiet that most people mistook for slowness. He was not slow. He was the most precise man Imani ever knew. He could look at a beam going up over a street and tell you from the sidewalk whether the crew had rushed the connection. He was usually right. He used to take her to job sites on Saturdays when her mother worked. She would sit on an overturned bucket with a thermos of sweet tea and watch him work, and he would talk to her the whole time, not down to her, but across to her, as if she were already the colleague she would one day become. He taught her that a building is not a thing you build and then forget. A building is a conversation that never ends. It pushes down and the ground pushes back. The wind shoves and the steel answers. The whole life of a building is that argument held in balance. And if you knew how to listen, the building would tell you exactly how the argument was going. Steel does not lie, he told her once, when she was 9, standing under a half-finished overpass with rain coming down around them. People lie. Paper lies. Steel just tells you the truth. Slow, in a language most folks never bother to learn. You learn that language and you will always know something the loud men in the room do not. She learned it. She learned it the way some children learn music, early and completely, until it was not a skill she used, but a sense she possessed. By the time she was 12, she could read a crack the way other people read a face. A crack has a grammar. The direction it runs, the way it widens at one end, whether it follows the mortar or cuts straight across the block, the fine white powder of crushed concrete at its lip, the rust bleed where moisture has reached the bone of the thing, all of it is sentences. Her father gave her that language, and he told her it was hers, that no one could ever take it back, and that it would outlast every job and every paycheck and every man who ever underestimated her. He did not live to see her become an engineer. He died when she was 26, of a heart that gave out on a Tuesday, 3 years before she finished the degree she had been paying for one night class at a time. She took only 2 things from his apartment that she truly kept. One was a brass folding spirit level, the small kind a steamfitter carries in a pocket, its bubble still true after 40 years. The other was the coat. The coat had been his work coat, a heavy canvas thing the colour of an old penny, lined for cold mornings on open steel. It was not stylish, it had never been stylish. Still, it had kept her father warm through 20 winters of standing where the wind cut hardest. And when she put it on, it still smelled faintly of him, of welding flux and cold air and the particular dust of a city that builds itself over and over. She had it taken in at the shoulders so it would fit her, and she wore it on every site she ever walked. The button that fell off in her second year of practice, she replaced herself with thread a shade too brown because that was the spool she had in the drawer, and she never bothered to fix the colour because the coat was not a thing she wore to be looked at. It was a thing she wore to work. That is the coat Del Pruitt laughed at now. Let me bring you back to the lobby, because the years between her father's overpass and that shining staircase had made Imani into something specific, and you need to know exactly what, so you understand why the laugh did not land the way Pruitt thought it would. Imani Sablon was by the night of the gala one of the most respected forensic structural engineers in the region. She did not design new buildings, she investigated them. When a parking structure sagged, when a balcony pulled away from a wall, when a floor developed a bounce that nobody could explain, the insurers and the courts, and sometimes the city itself, sent for her. She walked into the buildings that other engineers had signed off on, and she found the lie hiding inside the steel. She had testified in 9 separate cases. She had twice recommended that a building be emptied within the hour, and twice she had been right, and twice the slow argument of steel and gravity had proven her so before the week was out. She wore her father's penny-coloured coat to every one of those jobs, and 6 weeks before the gala the city had retained her firm for a quiet, ordinary task. Vosburn Tower was nearly finished, and before the certificate of occupancy could be issued before a single resident could move into those 41 floors of glass, an independent structural engineer of record had to review the construction and put her name to its safety. Not the developer's engineer, not the contractor's. An independent one, paid by no one with a stake in the answer, whose signature meant the building could be lived in. The city had chosen her firm. The city had chosen her. Del Pruitt did not know that. Del Pruitt did not read the technical correspondence. Del Pruitt sold units. What Imani knew, walking in off the rain, was something she had not yet been able to prove, and it had been keeping her awake for 9 nights. 3 weeks earlier she had been on the 18th floor with her tablet and her flashlight, doing the slow, unglamorous work of her trade, and she had found a hairline pattern in the concrete around one of the building's main transfer beams that she did not like. A transfer beam is a giant. It carries the weight of many floors above it, and hands that weight off sideways, around a column, the architect did not want where the engineer needed it, down into the bones below. It is one of the most heavily loaded pieces in the whole structure, and the cracking she found around it ran the wrong way, not the harmless map of curing concrete. A pattern that ran with the load, fine and diagonal, the kind of pattern her father would have stopped and looked at for a long time without saying anything. She had flagged it, she had written it up, and the developer's own engineering team had answered her within 2 days with a thick report full of calculations, concluding that the cracks were cosmetic, within tolerance, nothing to delay an opening over. They had a deadline. They had pre-sold half the building. They had a gala booked for the 24th of October with the mayor's chief of staff on the guest list. Imani had read their report 3 times. The math was clean. The math was, in fact, a little too clean. The way a story is too clean when someone has decided the ending first and worked backward. And she had come to the gala that night, not as a guest, not in a gown, but in her father's coat with her brass level in one pocket and her own field notebook in the other, because she wanted to stand in the lobby directly beneath that transfer beam and feel the building with her own body before she signed anything. or refused to. She had been in the lobby for 90 seconds when Del Pruitt laughed at her. "I'm sorry," he said when the laugh had run out, wiping at the corner of his eye as if she had told a joke. "This is a private event. Invitation only. I think you may have the wrong address." He said it loud enough that two waiters slowed. He said it the way a man says a thing. He wants other people to hear him say so that they will know which side of the room he is on. Imani looked at him. She did not raise her voice. Her voice, when she finally used it, was low and even. The voice of a person who has spent a career staying calm in rooms where staying calm was the entire job. "I have the right address," she said. "Do you?" He folded his arms, his watch turned toward the light. "Because the guest list is right here, and I don't recall a coat like that on it." A few people had begun to drift their attention toward the small scene at the foot of the stairs, the way a room does, sensing entertainment. Imani felt it. She felt the old familiar heat climb the back of her neck, the heat her father had taught her to hold still beneath, because a welder who flinches burns himself. She held still. "My name is on a list in this building," she said. "Just not that one." Pruitt smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to step back outside. We have security if we need them. There's a shelter 4 blocks east, if that's what you're looking for. They serve a hot meal until 9. There it was. The thing under the thing. He had decided, from a coat, exactly who she was and exactly what she deserved. And he had said it out loud in a room full of champagne, and for a moment the lobby was very quiet around them. This is the moment the whole night turns on. So I want you to hold it with me, the way you would hold your breath at the top of a staircase you are not sure of. A man in a $400 suit had just offered a soup kitchen to one of the only people in that building qualified to tell him whether the floor he was standing on would still be there in the morning. Imani did not argue. She had learned, long before that lobby, that you do not win these moments by arguing. You win them by being right and by waiting for the building to agree with you. She reached into the breast pocket of the old canvas coat, and Pruitt's hand twitched toward his lanyard as if she might be reaching for something dangerous, and what she took out was a small flat case worn soft at the corners, and from it she drew a single card and held it out to him between 2 fingers. "You should read this before you call security," she said. "For your sake, not mine." He took it the way you take a thing you intend to throw away. He glanced down at it with the bored half-attention of a man already planning his next sentence, and then his eyes stopped moving. The card was plain, heavy cream stock, black type, no flourish. It said her name, Imani Sablon, and beneath it, Principal, Sablon Forensic Structural Engineering. And beneath that, in smaller letters, the line that emptied the blood out of his face. Independent Structural Engineer of Record, Vosburn Tower, retained by the city. Certificate of Occupancy pending review. Pruitt read it twice. I know he read it twice because I was close enough to see his lips move. The second time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something he could live with, he stopped laughing. It is one thing to read about a man's confidence draining out of him. It is another to watch it happen in real time. The smile going slack, the chin coming down out of its raised position, the watch hand forgotten at his side. The card did not give Imani any power she had not already walked in with. It just made visible all at once the gap between what he had assumed and what was true, and the gap was enormous. Here is where the story refuses to be simple and where Del Pruitt earns his place in it as more than a fool. A smaller man would have apologized and slunk away. Pruitt did the opposite. Pruitt decided to fight. He had to. You have to understand the math of his evening. He had spent 3 months telling investors and pre-buyers that this building was perfect. The certificate was a formality he had told them weeks away. No question of the answer. His commissions, his standing, the chief of staff's handshake, he had been angling toward all night. Every bit of it rested on the floors above being exactly as flawless as he had promised. The woman holding that card was the one human being on Earth who could turn his perfect building into a problem. And so, instead of retreating, his face hardened into a new shape, and he came at her from a different direction. "You're the inspector," Ed, and his voice had changed. The mockery was gone. Something more dangerous had replaced it, something careful. I know exactly who you are. You're the one who's been holding up our certificate over a few hairline cracks that 3 other engineers already cleared. He turned slightly, raising his voice, pulling the watching room into it now on purpose. Folks, this is the consultant who's trying to delay a finished, fully certified building over cosmetic concrete. Our own structural team reviewed her concerns. The developer's engineers signed off. The contractor's engineers signed off. I have the reports upstairs in my office right now. It was a good move. I will give him that. He had taken her one card and answered it with a deck. He had reframed her, in front of the mayor's chief of staff, from a wronged woman in a worn coat into an obstacle, a stubborn delay, one nervous voice against 3 confident ones. And in a room full of people who had paid for confidence, that framing had teeth. A woman near the quartet murmured something to her companion. A man in a tuxedo frowned at Imani as if she had personally tried to ruin his evening. The current in the room shifted, and for the first time it was not flowing toward Pruitt's cruelty, it was flowing against Imani's caution. He had made her doubt look like the problem. This is the part of the story where Luck would have rescued a weaker character, and I want to be clear that Luck did not rescue Imani Sablon. She did not have a hidden ally about to descend the stairs. She did not have a document in her other pocket that ended the argument. She had what her father gave her on a rainy sidewalk 38 years before. She had the language of steel and a building standing all around her that had been quietly telling its truth the entire time to anyone who knew how to listen. So she did not answer Pruitt's 3 reports with a 4th report. She turned slowly, and she looked up at the great floating staircase beside them, the architectural centerpiece of the whole lobby, the curved ribbon of pale stone that everyone in that room had admired on their way in. And she looked at the wall where the top of that staircase met the 2nd-floor landing, and she went very still, the way her father went still under the overpass. "Pruitt," she said, and she did not raise her voice at all, which is why everyone leaned in to hear it. "How long has that door on the landing been sticking?" The room followed her gaze. Up at the top of the grand stair, set into the 2nd-floor wall, was a service door, painted to match the wall, the kind of door guests are not meant to notice. It was a small thing. Nobody had been thinking about it. Pruitt blinked. "What? That door?" She lifted one hand, not pointing dramatically, just indicating the way you would point out a bird. "It does not sit square in its frame anymore. You can see the gap. It is wider at the top than at the bottom. Somebody has been planing the bottom edge of it so it still closes, because the frame is no longer a true rectangle. The frame is leaning, just slightly. Just enough that a door which fit perfectly 6 months ago now drags." A young man in a catering vest, standing near the base of the stairs, went pale, and I will tell you why in a moment. "That is cosmetic too, I am sure your engineers would say." Imani went on, her voice steady and almost gentle. "A door is a small thing. A door is also the most honest instrument in any building. A door does not care about your reports. A door swings on 2 hinges, and it cannot lie about whether the wall it hangs in is still plumb. That door is telling me that the wall above this staircase has moved. Not much, a fraction of an inch. It has moved all the same, and it is still moving because someone has had to keep shaving the door to keep it shutting." Now, I need you to understand what she was actually saying, because the room did not understand it yet, and the not understanding is what made the next 60 seconds the most important of the entire night. Directly above that landing, 2 floors up, ran the transfer beam, the same transfer beam she had flagged 6 weeks earlier. The same beam the developer's report had called fine. If that beam was deflecting, if it was sagging under load, even by a hair, then everything fixed to it would tilt with it, including the wall the service door hung in. A sagging beam does not announce itself with a crash. It announces itself first with a door that will not close. It announces itself with a hairline crack running diagonal in the concrete. It announces itself in exactly the small, honest ways a steam-fitter's daughter had been taught to read before she was old enough to drive. "Bring me a marble," Imani said. Pruitt stared at her. "A what?" a marble, or a pen. Anything round. She was already moving, walking up the grand staircase in her father's worn coat, while 400 people in evening wear watched her climb. Nobody stopped her. The card was still in Pruitt's hand, and the certainty had gone out of him, and he did not know yet whether to fight her or follow her, so he followed her, and the room, sensing that something real was happening, drifted toward the foot of the stairs. A waiter, on instinct, handed her an orange from a fruit display. She thanked him. She reached the landing, knelt down at the threshold of the service door, in a coat that had knelt on 100 floors before this one, and she set the orange down gently on the smooth marble of the landing, an arm's length back from the door. The orange rolled. Slowly, without a push of its own accord, it rolled toward the door and came to rest against its base. The floor was not level. The floor of that landing, the floor everyone had walked across to admire the staircase, sloped toward the wall with the sticking door. Not enough to feel under your feet, enough to move an orange, enough to move a steel beam's worth of trouble down into the bones of the building. That is your slope, Imani said quietly, still kneeling. An orange does not read reports, it only reads gravity. And gravity is telling all of us, right now, that this landing is no longer flat, because the beam holding it up is no longer straight. The lobby had gone silent. The string quartet had stopped without anyone telling them to. And into that silence, Del Pruitt made the last and largest mistake of his night, because he still could not afford for her to be right. "This is theatre," he said, loudly, his voice cracking at the edges now. "An orange, a door. She's an entertainer. The building is certified. I have engineers, real engineers, who put their licenses on a report that says this structure is sound. And I'm not going to let a woman in a thrift store coat empty this gala with a parlor trick." And that was the sentence the room remembered. The woman in the thrift store coat. He had reached back, in his fear for the only weapon he had ever known how to use, the contempt he had walked up with, and he swung it as hard as he could. It missed. It missed, because a man had been standing at the back of the gathered crowd for the last 2 minutes. A tall man in a quiet dark suit who had come down from the upper floors without anyone noticing, and who had watched the orange roll. His name was Harlan Vesper, and he was the developer. He owned Vosburn Tower. He had built it with his own borrowed millions, his own sleepless years, and he had heard every word. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Del," Harlan Vesper said, "stop talking." The whole room turned. Vesper walked forward through the parted crowd until he stood at the foot of the stairs, looking up at the woman kneeling on his landing in a worn brown coat. And here is a thing I want you to notice, because it matters. He did not save her. He did not descend like a hero and announce her credentials and put Pruitt in his place with a speech. That is not what happened, and if it had, it would have been the wrong story. Imani Sablon did not need a wealthy man to rescue her. She had already won the argument with an orange. What Harlan Vesper did was simpler and harder. He chose to look. He chose in front of his investors and the mayor's chief of staff and a sales director who had told him for weeks that everything was fine to believe the building over the report. "Mrs. Sablon," he said, "I have read your firm's flag. My people told me you were being overcautious. They told me it was cosmetic." He glanced up at the sticking door and then down at the orange resting against its base, and something moved across his face that was older and heavier than the gala. "I am a developer. I am not an engineer. I built my first building under a man who told me that a door that will not close is a building asking for help. I have not thought about that sentence in 20 years. I am thinking about it now." He turned to the room, and his voice when it came was flat and absolute. "This event is over. I want every guest out of this lobby and onto the street in an orderly fashion in the next 10 minutes. I want the upper floors cleared. And I want Miss Sablon to tell me, tonight, what we are dealing with." There was a sound in the room then, not panic, but the soft collective intake of 400 people understanding at once that the future they had been standing inside was not as solid as the champagne had suggested. The waiters set down their trays, the quartet packed their instruments. And the great gleaming lobby of Vosburn Tower began, in an orderly and quiet way, to empty. Del Pruitt stood at the foot of the stairs with the business card still in his hand. Nobody was looking at him anymore. He had spent the entire evening being the most important voice in the room, and now he was the one piece of furniture nobody could figure out what to do with. He had not been arrested. He had not been shouted down. Something quieter and more complete had happened to him. He had become invisible in the exact way he had tried to make her invisible an hour before. The room had simply moved past him the way you move past a coat rack and left him holding a card with her name on it. It would have been enough for most people to be right in front of that crowd and let the building become someone else's problem. Imani Sablon was not most people. And her night was not over, because being right in a lobby is not the same as keeping people safe, and she knew the difference better than anyone there. She worked until 4 in the morning. She did not go home and let the building become someone else's problem. She borrowed a hard hat from the construction trader out back, traded a few words with a night security guard, who turned out to have known her father's old foreman, and she went up into the bones of the building with Harlan Vesper and a flashlight, while the lobby below sat dark and empty, and the orchids wilted in their tall vases. She found the transfer beam on the 18th floor. She showed Vesper the diagonal cracking with her own flashlight, traced it with one finger, showed him the fine white powder at the lip of it, where the concrete had been quietly crushing itself for weeks. She showed him the rust bleed beginning at one edge, the steel inside beginning to take on water and the burden at once. And she showed him the thing the developer's report had buried in an appendix, the thing she had suspected for 9 sleepless nights and now confirmed with her own hands. The transfer beam had been built with a reinforcing detail subtly different from the one the original design called for, a change made in the field months ago by a crew under a deadline to save time. A small substitution, the kind of thing that does not show up in a photograph and does not bother a report written by people who have decided the answer in advance. The kind of thing a door 3 floors down had been trying to tell anyone who would listen. It would have held through the winter probably, she told Vesper, kneeling by the beam at 2 in the morning, maybe through the spring. Buildings are patient. They give you warnings for a long time before they stop. The door was the warning. The slope was the warning. If you had moved 400 families in here next month and the beam had gone on flexing under their furniture and their footsteps and the first heavy snow load on the roof, you would have had your warning too. You would just have had it later and at a worse hour and with people asleep on the floors above it. Vesper was quiet for a long time. He was a wealthy man with his name on the deed of a 41-floor tower, and he was sitting on a concrete floor in a tuxedo at 2 in the morning, and he was looking at a thing that could have ended dozens of lives and several of his own years in a courtroom. And the man who had been hired to protect him from exactly this had instead spent 3 months selling units past it. "My engineers said you were difficult," he said finally. "I am difficult," Imani said. Difficult is the job. A building does not need an engineer who is agreeable. It needs one who is right. He almost laughed, and it was the first real thing his face had done all night. "Your father teach you that?" She looked at the beam and at the worn cuff of the coat resting against it, and for a moment she was 9 years old under an overpass in the rain. "My father taught me that steel does not lie. He taught me to be the kind of person who can hear it when it talks. Everything else I learned in night school. What happened after is the part most people never hear, and it is the part that holds the weight, because the satisfying moment in the lobby was only the stone, and what mattered was where the ripple reached. The building was emptied and shored within the week. Heavy steel posts went up in the lobby and on 3 floors above it, ugly and temporary, holding the load while the proper repair was designed. The opening was postponed by 7 months, and the cost ran to a figure with a great many zeros, and there was a season of bad news for Vosburn Tower, articles with words like delay and defect, the kind of season that ends some developers. It did not end, Harlan Vesper, and the reason it did not is the part most people never hear about. Because when the city investigators and the insurers and eventually a courtroom wanted to know how a defective transfer beam had nearly been certified, the answer was not a mystery. The answer was a thick report full of clean math, signed by the developer's own structural team, concluding that an independent engineer's flag was cosmetic and the building was sound. That report had 3 engineers' licenses on it. All 3 faced their licensing board. 2 were suspended. 1, the senior of them, the man who had decided the ending and worked the math backward to reach it, surrendered his license rather than face the hearing. And the report had been championed internally, pushed up the chain, sold to the investors and the press and the mayor's office by the director of sales. Del Pruitt had not written the math. He had done something worse with it. He had taken the math and turned it into certainty. And he had stood in a marble lobby and offered a soup kitchen to the one person who could have stopped the whole thing 6 weeks earlier if anyone had listened to her flag instead of his confidence. When the dust settled, Pruitt was gone from the development, not arrested, not ruined in any dramatic public way. He simply found when he went looking for his next position that the industry is smaller than it looks, and that the story of the orange on the landing had travelled, and that no developer in the region wanted to hire the man who had nearly let a building open over a defect a woman in an old work coat had read at a distance with her own eyes. He became in the end exactly the thing he had tried to make of Imani: overlooked, passed by, a man whose name brought a particular expression to a particular kind of face. The consequence was not a punishment anyone handed him. It was simply the shape his own choices had carved, waiting for him to walk into it. This is not in the end a story about Del Pruitt, and he held far too many words already on the night this happened to be allowed, the last one. Let me give you the ending that matters. 7 months later, on a clear morning in May, Fosburn Tower opened for real. There was no chandelier the size of a car this time, no string quartet, no champagne. Harlan Vesper had decided against another gala. Instead, he held a small ceremony in the lobby, just the crew who had fixed the building, the city inspectors, a handful of the first residents, and 1 guest of honor. He had asked Imani to come. She almost did not. She did not like ceremonies, and she did not like being looked at, and she said as much to him on the phone. He told her that he was not asking her to be looked at. He was asking her to put her name on the building the way she should have been allowed to from the start. So she came in the worn brown coat with her father's brass level in one pocket and her field notebook in the other, the same as always. And she stood in the lobby where a man had once laughed at her, beneath the great floating staircase that now stood true and plumb above a repaired beam. And she signed the certificate of occupancy for Fosburn Tower, the independent engineer of record. The name the building had been waiting for. She wrote it in the same plain hand her father had taught her to keep steady, and when she set the pen down the floor beneath her was level, and an orange set anywhere on that landing would have stayed exactly where you put it. Harlan Vesper did not give a speech about her. He had learned by then that she did not need one. He only said to the small gathered crowd that the building was safe because one person in a room full of confident people had been willing to be the difficult voice and had been right, and that he hoped he would have the sense the next time to listen to her the first time instead of the second. Then he did one small thing, and it is the thing I want to leave you with, because it says everything the orange said and more. Near the elevators on the wall, where every resident of those 41 floors would pass 100 times, he had mounted a small brass plate. Not large, not flashy, the kind of plate you have to be close to read. It did not have his own name on it. It did not have the architect's name, or the contractor's, or the bank's. It had 4 lines, in plain engraved letters, at the exact height where a person standing in the lobby would meet them at eye level. Certified safe for occupancy. Imani Sablon, structural engineer of record. This building stands because one person refused to stop listening to it, in memory of the welders who taught her how. She read it twice. She had not known it was there. She did not cry because she was not a woman who cried in lobbies, and her father had not raised her to. She stood in front of that small brass plate instead for a long moment in the old penny-coloured coat, and she reached up, and with 2 fingers she touched the line that mentioned the welders, the way you touch a name on a stone, lightly, so as not to wear it away. And then she buttoned the coat against the May morning air, the button a shade too brown, and she walked out through the doors of a building that was standing and would go on standing for a great many years because of what a quiet man under an overpass had once taught a girl on a bucket about the language of steel. The card she had handed Del Pruitt that first night, the plain cream card with her name on it, ended up framed on the wall of a small office, not because she was proud of the night, but because of something she said to a young engineer who came to work for her the following year, a young woman who had grown up the way Imani had. Watched and doubted and underestimated, and who wanted to know how you survive a room that has already decided what you are. You do not survive it by shouting, Imani told her. You survive it by knowing something true that the loud people in the room do not, and by being patient enough to let the truth arrive on its own legs. They will laugh at your coat. Let them laugh. The coat is not the thing. The thing is what you carry in the pocket and what you carry in your hands, and what someone who loved you once poured into you on a rainy sidewalk when you were too young to know would one day save a building full of sleeping families. And if you have ever been the person in the worn coat, the one the room decided about before you opened your mouth, the one whose competence was invisible because of what you were wearing or where you came from or the shade of your skin, then you already know the weight of that lobby, and you already know the quiet that comes after you are finally undeniably right. Sit with that quiet sometime. It is the one thing in this story no boss and no badge and no man at a door can hand you or take away, because it was never theirs to give. It was built slow in a language you carry in your hands, and it lasts a great deal longer than a laugh.